Please come to your seats. Please come to order, folks. Welcome to evening 3 of the spring annual town meeting for 2018. Couple of quick comments, and just as reminders, Walpole Media TV is pleased to be providing live coverage of tonight's town meeting on Comcast Channel 22 and Verizon Channel 30. Live streaming of this meeting is also available on YouTube by going to the Walpole Media channel. And you can watch the replay of this meeting anytime by going to the website walpolemedia.tv and clicking on the on-demand button. I'd also like to just, as a reminder, that the Walpole League of Women Voters at Westwood Walpole in Dedham, will have their annual Spring Candidates Night on Monday, May 21st at 7 p.m. in the community room at the Walpole Public Library. I'll rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, folks, I just need to confirm the tellers again for this evening. Mr. Lombardi on the left has already come down. Mr. Forsberg. Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Mr. Leith in the center, and Mr. Gallivan in the center. Thank you. Mr. Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Laurent. And Mr. Buckley. Thank you. So I just want to touch upon a couple of reminders here, folks, again. The time limits. So if someone goes over the time limits, which again is 5 minutes for the primary sponsor of the article or speaker to the article, and 3 minutes for all other speakers. If someone goes over that time limit, you may call a point of order. Please make sure you're right. I might miss the start by a little bit. I do try to be spot on as best I can, but I am juggling a few things. An RTM member may stand and rise and ask for an extension for the speaker, and the speaker themselves may ask for an extension request. So that is in your hands. This is your meeting. I am just here to facilitate the meeting. Those rules may be addressed as you see fit by making a point of order or a request. I'd also like to remind, because we may have a couple of outside speakers wishing to come to the microphone today. I say outside, not RTM members. So the speakers, the RTM members, obviously we do try to get to them first, and all the town officials with respect to the article. Remember to state your name and precinct. And if the speaker is retained, paid, or otherwise, please indicate that in your comments. You'll notice there's a little difference with the mics tonight. They took the booms away. That was done because a lot of you were turning the mics to address the audience, which is natural. I would do the same if my back was to them. Unfortunately, it's not. It needs to be this way because it's set up for lighting, the cameras, so it ruins the audio and visual quality on the recording. So please try to keep the microphone where it is, tilt it up or down to your mouth, but you're not going to be able to swing it or turn it any longer. And no Steven Tyler moves with the microphone either, okay, as I saw someone demonstrate earlier. At this point in time, I am going to propose, and it's, again, your vote, that we take Article 39 as our first order of business this evening. This requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Article 39. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town take no action. This is a citizen's petition. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Let's see. No action, 1201.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Mr. Moderator, the Board of Selectmen voted 3-0 for no action, and through you, Mr. Moderator, if I could provide just a little perspective on our debate.
Yes, Mr. Kraus, go right ahead.
The concern that our board had is that the town of Walpole is generally not in the business of taking back privately owned land, and we debated this for quite some time. This property was sold in February of 2015 and then again in October of 2017. And at no time prior to January, when it came before us, was the board, as a Board of Selectmen or any of us as RTMs, we had zero involvement in this property. So it was debated, and ultimately it was a 3-2 to return it back.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. At this point in time, we have a substitute motion for Article 39 that was submitted by Mr. Pila of Precinct 7 and seconded by Mr. Senna of Precinct 8. That motion I will read, and I will read as clearly and slowly as I can because it's rather long. The substitute motion is that the town vote in accordance with the provisions of General Law, Chapter 79, to authorize the Board of Selectmen to acquire by gift, purchase, and/or eminent domain for general municipal purposes under such terms and conditions as the Board of Selectmen deems to be in the best interest of the town. The fee or lesser interest in all or a portion of the parcel of land located at 1350 North Street, Walpole, Mass., comprising of approximately 1.25 acres, more or less, together with any structures and improvements thereon, shown as Assessor's Map 5, Parcel 52, and as more particularly identified in the deed recorded in the Norfolk County Registry of Deeds in Book 35502, page 169. And as funding therefore and all costs incidental and related thereto, to appropriate the sum of $505,000. No, that's right. Am I saying that right? $505,000. Yes, I apologize. And authorize the treasurer, with the approval of the Board of Selectmen, to borrow said sum pursuant to the provisions of General Law, Chapter 44, Sections 7 or 8, and any other enabling authority, and, as may be necessary or appropriate, to authorize the Board of Selectmen to convey a historic preservation restriction or restrictions in such land, execute instruments, or take any other action necessary or convenient to carry out the vote taken hereunder. And further, that any premium received upon the sale of any bonds or notes approved by this vote, lest any such premium applied to the payment of the cost of issuance of such bonds or notes may be applied to the payment of costs approved by this vote in accordance with Chapter 44, Section 20 of the General Laws, thereby reducing the amount authorized to be borrowed to pay such costs by a like amount. I know that was a mouthful. Are there any questions or comments with regards to the substitute motion for Article 39? So just a reminder here, folks, RTM members should be sitting before the break back there. If you're not an RTM member, you should stay behind the break. I should have reminded that previously. And there is, excuse me, I know you're raising your hand back there. You're not an RTM member, correct? Okay. You're the petitioner of the article. You may come down. You can come right down here. You're the article petitioner.
So I was told I had.
You have 5 minutes. You're the petitioner.
My personal timekeeper.
Yes.
My personal timekeeper has been clocking me at roughly 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Can I request permission for the additional 30 seconds?
All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Thank you very much.
There you go. Miss, will you please state your name and your address?
Yes, my name is Sue Shockett. I'm 1340 North Street, and I'm the lead petitioner on Article 39. So there's a certain feeling that you get when you turn off of Route 109 and begin the drive down North Street towards Walpole Center. Donna Stanton on County Street expressed it to me in an email by saying, "One of my favorite things is driving up North Street, seeing all the beautiful land, the white fences, the flags flapping in the wind. It's my me time, and it offers me serenity and beauty." Another friend told me about a neighbor in South Walpole who commutes an hour and a half each direction to a job on the North Shore. He considered moving to be closer to work, but he said that when he turns down North Street on his way home each day, the commute is all worthwhile. I think that we all know that feeling. It's a feeling of nostalgia. The historic homes, the rolling fields with horses grazing in the sun, gives us a glimpse into a simpler time. That's exactly the feeling that the Walpole Preservation Alliance is working to preserve. We've been contacted by residents of Norwood, Westwood, Medfield, even Wrentham, asking how they can help us to preserve this jewel that's so important, not just to Walpole, but to the character of our entire surrounding area. The Massachusetts State Constitution states explicitly, Mr. Johnson, can I have my third slide there, please?
Mike, can we go with slide number 3 then?
Nope, the next one. That's, yeah, that's the one. Thank you. States explicitly that a town has the right to take a property by eminent domain to preserve the character and the history of an area, and the Walpole Preservation Alliance believes that the town should exercise that right in this instance. Can I go to slide 2, please? Yes, thank you. 1350 North Street is a pre-revolutionary home that has stood on the top of the hill on North Street since 1745. 143 of those years were under the ownership of just one family. That makes it 273 years old, and not only the third oldest house in Walpole, but among the oldest homes in the state of Massachusetts. It is a National Historic Register quality home that is slated for demolition because of the greed of one family. One family who values personal profit at the expense of our local history and without consideration to the character of our town. The current landowner, David Allen of Foxborough, is a developer who plans to raise the house at 1350 North Street and level the land to construct a commercial daycare center to serve 100 children. He was made aware of neighborhood opposition to the demolition of the historic home, but has refused to speak with the neighbors when asked repeatedly by our town administrator. He's also been made aware that we have 5 different cash buyers who are interested in purchasing the home with the intent of restoring and preserving it as a single-family home that it's been for the past 273 years. Again, he has declined to even discuss the possibility of abandoning his plans. Once his planned demolition is complete, it can never be undone. David Allen and his daughter, Maureen Mazzola, have no prior experience owning and operating a daycare center. This will be their first attempt out of the gate. It's quite a gamble for the town of Walpole to allow the destruction of a 273-year-old home for the construction of a commercial enterprise to inexperienced and unsympathetic business owners. If their business succeeds, we've traded a beautiful antique home on a rural lot for a blacktopped parking lot and a commercial building that we'll be stuck with indefinitely. If the business fails, then we've done it all in vain, and we'll be stuck with a commercial building in non-conforming zoning status. The damage cannot be undone. How is this allowed when the area is a rural zoning area? In a nutshell, the owner's trying to take advantage of a loophole that allows schools to operate outside of established zoning laws. North Street is a designated scenic road, and any other type of non-agricultural commercial use would never be considered. Can I actually get slide 1, just the picture of the house now, please? 2 years ago, a neighbor who owns a farm on North Street was denied a business license to open a farm stand because of restrictions on commercial business on the scenic road. That was a small farm stand on an actual farm. Now, because Mr. Allen has found a loophole, the town feels as though its hands are tied and it needs to accept his plans for a much larger commercial business that completely transforms the aesthetics of our street. I've spoken with hundreds of people at this point, all of us trying to come up with creative solutions around this issue that wouldn't require the intervention of the town. We've come up short. It appears that the only solution that will ensure that the home at 1350 North Street continues to stand for another 273 years will be for the town to take the house by eminent domain, place historic restrictions on the property, and then resell it to one of the 5 preservation-minded cash buyers who have already spoken up. There should be little to no expense to the town of Walpole because the town will immediately resell the property. Some of you have expressed concerns that the landowner may bring suit against the town. That is a risk. After all, almost anyone can sue over anything, but that should not keep the town from doing what is right to preserve the character of our town. Moreover, it is the opinion of our attorney, an expert in land use law, that there would be no merit or grounds for a lawsuit since the town is enacting its constitutionally protected right to historic preservation. I'm asking you all to please vote yes on Article 39 and help us to maintain the part of what makes Walpole the place that we all love and feel so proud of. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Shockley. Folks, please be seated. Thank you. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I move for a roll call vote.
On the substitute motion, Mr. Hamilton? Yes. Okay, we need 20 members to stand with you to have a roll call vote. On the substitute motion, it's very specific. Yes, sir. Point of order.
Could we have an opportunity for the substitute petitioner to provide the intent of the substitute motion prior to voting?
Well, right now all we're doing is voting on... State your question again.
I request that the substitute motion, that the intent of the substitute motion by the petitioner be laid out before this body prior to voting on the motion itself.
I don't think that's a point of order. That's a question to the petitioner as your RTM member. So you could come up and ask that question when...
What, after we vote?
No. Okay. When you just get in line and come to the microphone as you're an RTM member, sir, correct?
Correct, yep.
Yes, so you'll just come to and ask, and I will redirect the question.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. All right. 19. I see 19. Let me try again. 1, 2. Larry, you're not standing, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 17, 18, 19, 20. Yes, you know what? And I do have 20 people standing, so we will have a roll call vote when this comes to vote on the substitute motion. All set? Okay. Mr. Pittman.
Pittman, Precinct 1. 2 questions, more procedural, I guess. In this language, it's saying that it has to be approved by the Board of Selectmen. And from what I'm gathering, your vote or vote to send it to committee or whatever, if the Board of Selectmen are not supporting it, how can that take place?
One moment.
Yes. Yes.
Excuse me, folks. We now have to vote on we have the 20 people stood. So I need a second from the 20 people that stood, and then we need to vote on it. So would somebody second Mr. Hamilton's? Okay, so actually, that's a good point. So we have okay, so all those in favor, please say aye. So this is on the roll call vote. Okay, so 20 people have moved it. I apologize for the confusion. Now that they've moved it, this body votes on whether we're going to go with a roll call vote. Okay? It's a majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. I had a feeling that was going to happen. I'm just going to go straight to a standing count because I have a feeling we have some voices in here that are carrying. On the left, please, the tellers, please rise. Tellers that are in favor of a roll call vote, please raise your hand. Tellers only. Tellers only. You'll get your chance. Yes. You can just shout it from there.
I'm just questioning, we haven't accepted the substitute motion as the motion and voted on it, so I don't know how we can vote on that we're going to be voting as a roll call on it until we accept the substitute motion, Mr. Moderator.
One moment while I deal with the point of order at hand. Okay, folks, please settle down. So the roll call vote is on the vote to make the substitute motion the main motion, okay, which will be a favorable action. Wait a minute. No, it's the substitute motion is to make it the main motion. So that is what the roll call vote is for. And then we will vote again on it as the main motion if it prevails. Clear? Okay. There is a second point of order.
Are we voting on whether to make this a roll call vote?
Yes, we are voting to make this a roll call vote to make the substitute motion the main motion.
I heard that, but at first we just did a vote to see if we would do a roll call vote, and you said we have to do a standing.
So yes, so once. And that is because it wasn't a clear majority when you shouted. Actually, to be honest with you, it seemed to me the noes were in favor. But I learned the other nights that you have to be careful about the volume of people's voices. So I think this is important enough that I think I'm going to go for a standing vote at this point in time.
Standing vote to decide whether we're going to do a roll call vote.
Perfect. Thank you.
Point of order.
Yes, sir.
Andrew Basevich, Precinct 2. It appears to me that we have two different versions of Article 39 in play, but there's been no effort thus far to distinguish between them.
There's one version. The substitute motion is what's in play right now. That is what is on the floor presently. So Mr. Basevich, just to help clarify this, I am required to read the main motion of the Finance Committee, and then I accepted the substitute motion in place of the main motion. That's where we're at right now. That's what's before us. The substitute motion is what we're debating.
But wouldn't common sense suggest that before we vote on the substitute motion, that those of us in this body are informed about the differences between the original motion and the therefore, thereby informing the vote we're about to take.
So, Mr. Basevich, just to be clear, we are not voting to make this the main motion. Clear? The substitute motion right now is just that it's a substitute motion. 20 individuals have stood and asked this body that when we make that final vote, after the debate is complete, to answer all your questions, that it will require a roll call vote. That's all. Okay? Is that clear to everybody? Okay. Now, is it a point of order?
Yes, point of order. Or a question to you, Mr.
It's
Moderator?
a point of order.
The
Go ahead.
the petitioner has requested to withdraw the original article and just to go with the substitute motion.
The petitioner has a substitute motion on the floor. That's what we're going with right now.
Point of order, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, Mr. O'Leary.
It's my understanding that once the 20 people have stood supporting a roll call vote, there is no further vote beyond that. That makes it a roll call vote.
I will double check, but that's not what I was. So and is seconded, so I'm going to read you specifically what it says. So under 5(1)(a), okay, if prior to taking any vote, a motion is made from the floor and seconded by no less than 20 RTM members, such a motion requires a majority for adoption.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, back to, now, you know what? Before we do this, and now that everybody's clear, I'm going to ask the tellers to sit for a second. For all those in favor simply of having a roll call vote that will be called out by, your name will be called out specifically by the town clerk, and you will vote. All those in favor of that, to make this substitute motion the main motion, we will debate it before, that it becomes a roll call vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The noes have it. So we will not do a roll call vote. I think that was very clear that time. Mr. Pittman.
We return. The question, I guess, again, is back to, I don't know who can answer this.
Is this a point of order, or are you speaking?
No, this is regarding the substitute motion.
Okay, so we are now debating the substitute motion.
My question was, a few minutes ago, was, it says here it has to be with the approval of the Board of Selectmen to borrow said sum. My impression from hearing everything is that the Selectmen do not want to do this. So my question is, is this going to force the Selectmen to go forward with this?
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, I understand the question is, in the event that this article were voted favorably to authorize the Board of Selectmen to take the subject property by eminent domain, would it obligate them to take it by eminent domain? And in my opinion, no, it would not. It would authorize them so that they would have the authority to do it, but not the obligation.
Thank you. One more question through you, Mr. Moderator. Does anybody have a history of this property? I'm just concerned, do we know about any environmental issues? It's been a farm or something, and I'm just concerned if we buy this, and I'm not against it or for it, really, I just want to listen to everything. But I'm concerned that, are we going to have any environmental issues if we take ownership and have to clean something up?
Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Pittman, from the town's perspective, I can tell you that we have done no research onto this property, just our own, just what our records tell us with the Board of Assessors. I went on Redfin this morning and just printed out the most recent property report. So no, we'd have to do an assessment on this property. We'd have to do an environmental study. We'd have to have land surveyors come in, mark it all out. We'd have to have an appraiser come in. So no.
Excuse me, would the petitioner know? I mean, maybe they know the history better than, they seem to have a pretty good history of the background.
Ms. Shockley?
I'm done, thank you.
You can speak from that microphone. Sure.
So the history, it's been a privately owned residence for 273 years. As far as environmental concerns go, I know it does need a new septic system. If the town were to purchase the property, though, the intent is that the town would right away put it out to bid for a cash buyer to come in. So technically, we want the town to essentially float the money until a cash buyer can purchase it immediately. So there should not be any type of environmental concern.
Mr. Moderator.
Yes, Mr.
Can I
Johnson.
just follow up on that? It's not that simple. We can't just flip it. We'd have to go through this court process, the eminent domain taking. I believe that you have the memo that I provided in the back of town meeting here. There are certain risks involved. Town council outlined those risks. That is a prolonged battle that will certainly probably last years. If we were successful in the taking, we can't just turn around and sell it. We would have to go, I mentioned the assessment. We'd have to have an appraiser come in here, determine what fair market value is. And then it's an authorization to borrow under this article. And then we would have to borrow the money, which isn't programmed into our borrowing quite yet. And if we ever wanted to sell it, we would have to come back to this body and ask you for permission to sell the property. And then we would have to put it out to bid, basically do a reverse 30B, which anyone in this town, anyone in the state could come in and buy. So it's not we could flip it right away. It's multiple years process.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Pila.
To you, Mr. Moderator. Council, if this is the legislative body for the town, and the Board of Selectmen is the executive branch, if this body, whichever way it votes, makes a decision on any of these articles, the executive branch is obligated per the wishes of the legislative body, town meeting.
Mr. Pila,
Is it not?
I believe town council stated that already, but I will confirm. Town council?
Mr. Moderator, through you, my opinion previously and again is that this article, if it is approved, would give the Board of Selectmen the authority to take the land, but not the obligation. It would be within the board's discretion to not take the property.
Through you, Mr. Moderator?
Excuse me, point of order? Am I hearing a point of order?
No, it's me, Dan.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Lots of voices today. Thank you, Mr. Kraus.
No, we sought counsel on this, and to your point, it's not an obligation, but how this nets out will potentially, how it nets out, will give us the authority to take an action. And there's a big difference between the two. And as I said, our vote was 3-2 to return it back. So depending on where we end up with the substitute motion this evening, we might need to take a different course.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Pila. Mr. Chekarowski.
Philip Shaharevsky, Precinct 7. Through you, Mr. Moderator, to Town Council, I did read the memo we got from Mr. Johnson, and I just thought it would be helpful if Town Council could summarize the risks that she wrote in the memo for the town, if the town did do this.
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, yes, there are two main risks. The first one that I outlined in the memorandum was the risk under the existing case law that in the event the town meeting authorizes the taking, that there could be a concern depending upon the debate that happens this evening and what information is presented to town meeting, the reasons that town meeting expresses in the event that town meeting votes to take the land as to why it's taking the land. Certainly, taking the property for historic preservation is absolutely, unquestionably a lawful purpose to take land and property by eminent domain. There's no question about that. But we do have case law that talks about the fact that there is the potential, there is a risk that in the event that the true motive is not the purpose that would be actually allowed as a proper purpose, if there's some other purpose that can be proven, that, for instance, when a property is offered for a particular type of development, and then as a result of that, someone comes forward and asserts, well, you know, we want to take that property, and they have a lawful purpose. If there is proof to a court that the real reason for the taking is the unlawful purpose, then the taking could be set aside. Now, I will say that it takes a lot of evidence for that to happen. There is a very basic presumption that a legislative body of this type acts in good faith and for good reason, and so there would have to be good reason to find that there was bad faith. So I just offer that as a potential risk, and obviously, again, taking property for historic purposes, preservation purposes, is a proper purpose. The second risk that I outlined in my memo is one that happens with any eminent domain taking situation. When a property comes forward and is proposed for a taking, an appropriation is put forward to support the taking in the event that the taking authority, in this case the Board of Selectmen, moves forward with it. What everyone needs to understand, though, is that, let's say the full amount of $505,000 is authorized by this meeting, and let's say the Board of Selectmen goes forward and offers damages of $505,000 in exchange for the taking. There is the potential, of course, that the property owner could come back and say, that's not representative of the fair market value, which is the highest and best use of the property by, you know, a willing hypothetical buyer. In the event that there was an appeal on that basis, then a jury would decide as to whether the damages awarded by the town were appropriate or not. If the jury were to come back with a higher number, then that higher number is the one that will obtain, and that is the one that the town would be liable for. So there's not the ability to take a property, let's say for the $505,000, and then have a jury come back in the event that there's an appeal, and the jury says, well, it's a much higher number. There's not an opportunity for the town at that point to say, well, you know, we don't want the property for that higher amount. The town would be liable for that amount. And that's just a risk that happens with each type of taking of this sort. So I just raise it as a risk.
Thank you. And I think that it would be a terrible loss to the town to lose this historic house, but I'm just not sure the town should take the risk of doing it by eminent domain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chekarowski. Ms. Grace.
Audrey Grace, Precinct 6. I have two questions through you, Mr. Moderator, per Town Council. The first is in the fair market value for highest and best use, does that include the proposed use for a daycare business? The second is when and if the municipality or if Walpole owns the property, are we liable for damages or personal injury that occurs on the property if it's a town-owned property for that lengthy years of time that the town administrator was talking about, in which we would have to sell the property? So would we be liable for anything that would happen to anyone on that property during that time?
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, I'll answer the second question first. With respect to the town's liability, whenever it owns property, the town certainly makes sure that it's insured and that it's properly taken care of. There is always liability, you know, in the event of negligence or, you know, some kind of adverse event. With respect to your first question, with regard to the value of the land, you end up having appraisers. The town would have an appraisal done before any taking. Under Chapter 79, Section 7A, it is not possible to do a taking. The eminent domain authority, in this case the Board of Selectmen, can't go forward and actually do an order of taking without having an appraisal. And the appraisal would go out and look at all of the issues that you're talking about and determine what the highest and best use of the property is. And I really couldn't speculate as to what that would be. That would be an expert appraiser that would go out and would perform that kind of work.
Thank you. It just seems to me that this should be resolved privately between the neighboring landowners, and if it seems like if the owner of the property has a number in mind and it just hasn't been reached yet, and maybe they can resolve that privately. But I think, as Phil said, that this seems like a huge risk for the town to take this property on.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Mr. Trudell.
Trudell, Precinct 4 and FinCom member. Through you, Mr. Moderator, just looking for the timeline for the actual processing of eminent domain. At what point can the town actually give notice that would prohibit the owner from doing any additional changes to the property?
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, the question was what would the timeline be in the event that the town were to be aware that changes were happening at the property. And the timeline in terms of moving, assuming that the article is voted favorably and that the Board of Selectmen was authorized to take the property and determined that they wish to take the property, the timeline for how quickly to move forward with that effort would be in the hands of the Board of Selectmen. I mean, there are certain procedures that need to be followed, an order of taking, an assessment of pro tanto damages, and so forth. And of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, there would be a requirement under Chapter 79, Section 7A, that there be an appraisal of the property. And so, of course, those things do take some time, but I couldn't tell you what the timing would be.
Additional question. So if town meeting votes in favor of the substitute motion tonight, someone can come back and challenge within a window any article in town meeting, which means we have to reconvene. And between now and then, the person can have their demo permit in hand, and we're behind the 8 ball because he can go and make a commitment to demo the building. We haven't made a step forward with eminent domain paperwork.
That's not my understanding. My understanding is that once the meeting dissolves, then it's in the Attorney General's hands.
Well, actually, all that would happen here if this article were approved is that the Board of Selectmen would be authorized but not obligated to go forward with the taking. And then in the event that the taking were to go forward, then they would, and they did the taking, did the assessment, did the order of taking with an award of damages, then from that point there would be a 3-year appeal period under Chapter 79 to contest the damages.
It was my understanding, though, that once town meeting closes, there's a window of opportunity for citizens to come back and contest the actions of town meeting, saying that they want to have an item evaluated.
He's getting the zoning bylaws confused.
Are you, through you, Mr. Moderator, are you referring to the referendum process?
It was my understanding that town meeting has to become a public record, and then any group of citizens can challenge that public record and say that it was not the intent of citizens that are being represented by town meeting.
I think you're talking, through you, Mr. Moderator, I think you're talking about the referendum process to bring something to a ballot question. Is that what you're referring to? I think that's what you're referring to, and there is a very short time frame for that, certainly. I'm not sure that I've seen that happen in recent memory.
So just to clarify, it goes to so when we dissolve, the articles are then reviewed by the Attorney Generals. There's a window there, and as Town Council stated, your referendum.
Close tonight, Board of Selectmen can then call a meeting 3 days from now, vote to go forward with eminent domain, notify the landowner, and then therefore not issue a demo permit when it comes up.
But I don't have the money programmed in there.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I think what Mr. Trudell was laying out the timeline that that the Board of Selectmen would then subsequently meet, review, and make a decision of whether they were going to proceed on eminent domain, and that starts the time. That starts the clock.
Through you, Mr. Moderator?
Yes, Mr. Kraus.
While that scenario is the way it would probably go, we would have to figure out a funding source as well, since...
Just to follow up to that, yes, it is authorized.
It's authorization, but...
We don't have that borrowing program in right now. I mean, is this going to require an override? I don't know. Am I going to be able to come back here at the fall or next spring and say, we're able to find funds available in the budget to pay for the borrowing costs? I don't know, because we haven't programmed it in yet, so.
And Mr. Moderator, just to
Yes.
follow up on the prior question about an appeal of sorts, there is a referendum procedure under the charter. And I think that may be what you're referring to under the charter, section 2-13. And there's a very tight time frame. The petition has to be filed with the town clerk within 10 days. So I think that must be what you're referring to.
And that 10-day was the same amount of time that the Attorney General comes back and confirms. I believe. Yes, no?
No, you're thinking of bylaws. This is not,
Okay.
this is not a bylaw, so
Thank
it would
you.
not go to the AG.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Trudell. Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, your first was a roll call vote, so I'll allow you your time to speak on this article. Just making it clear for other folks that think you're here for a second time.
Thank you. Hamilton, Precinct 5. I rise in favor of the substitute motion. People in South Walpole and West Walpole enjoyed the support of people in North Walpole when we had what you would call quality of life issue with the sludge dump. So I would hope that the people in South Walpole and West Walpole would support this article for the people in North Walpole who have a quality of life issue with this proposed use of this property. I believe it is commercial property and residential use, and it is not what I would have voted for when we allowed daycare centers in homes. Now, having said that, I was on the Board of Selectmen when we took land by eminent domain. Was it easy? Not always. Did we rise to the occasion? Did we solve the problems? Did we amicably settle the issues that came up because of the eminent domain? Yes, we did. Did town administrator burn a little midnight oil? I'm sure they did. We can do this. It is the issue is before this body, and town council has not ruled it out of order. Therefore, we can vote it. So I hope that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton.
Sue Naughton, Precinct 4. 2 questions through you, Mr. Moderator. In addition to the $505,000, what else would the town need to spend on these appraisals, assessments, and even the minimum of legal fees that we might be subject to? And then a little bit, but where would that money come from?
Mr. Johnson?
Just a shot right here. Just knowing some of the work we've recently done, we'd have to do an appraisal. I'm guessing the appraisal is going to cost up to $5,000. We'd have to do some land survey work, which we are doing on the rail trail and back of South Street. I think that's costing us around $5,000 to $10,000 to lay out the old rail bed there. So figure 15. Town council fees to see this through the process, 25, maybe 20, 10, 15, let's call it. So that's just that. We also have to deal with the Title V septic situation there. I don't know if we'll need to replace the tank, possibly up to 20,000, depending on how the soils perk up there. Shot in the dark, 100,000, easy.
And where would that money come from? Who knows?
I'd have to come back to this body next fall or next spring and figure that out. I mean, I did graze over the override situation because I don't know if it's going to involve an override because I'm good at working on buildings with my finance team, but this one wasn't programmed, it wasn't planned. We planned for these buildings for 3 or 4 years leading up to it. I'd probably need to come back to this body with all of that and possibly the voters of the town of Walpole.
Thank you.
Mr. Snuffer, Mr. Pila, just so you know, I know you've spoke before, so if you could let Ms. Donellan come before. Yes, of course. That's okay. I just want to point out something here, folks, just as a momentary jab at our 33-year veteran, Mr. Snuffer, who unfortunately will not be able to speak this evening due to a cold and a laryngitis. I'm sure that will disappoint many of you. Mr. Snuffer.
Cliff Snuffer, Precinct 6. I'd like to read a letter on behalf of my father. 20-plus years ago, after 2 years of difficult work, I and others like mine stood before this body and through you asked this town of Walpole residents to spend $7.5 million of your hard-earned dollars to save Adams Farm from development. Nearly 200 homes were planned, hundreds of acres would be scarred and or lost forever. The farm's historical value would be lost forever. We offered all the rational and cogent arguments as to the value of conservation, preservation, dwindling open space. We stated the obvious, the fact that green space, not asphalt, cleansed the air, that biodiversity was under assault but that argument that won that day was a statement that if you are going to get the bill, we should get the land. The bill was, is, and will always be the loss of this historical open space. It became the most compelling, most logical, good faith argument. Once lost, the land is lost forever. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts awarded the town of Walpole of its highest awards for conservation, preservation of such valuable property. The whole town, not any one individual. Thanks for the foresight of Walpole citizens, we have paid off the debt. We own this piece of heaven outright. We see those who were children back then taking their children to enjoy the bounty that nature provides. We see the pride on the grandparents' faces that this investment was something special that they did for their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. One other significant event took place at town meeting. We bought the Elm Street School for $1 million. Two historic decisions of enormous value to all of us and our families for decades, each made after taking the roads less traveled. Walpole's collective wisdom is worthy of our reflection and remembrance. Do I prefer eminent domain as a stopgap? Not really. Left with few, if any, alternatives, I can understand it. I, like you, am able to deal with the historical, not the hysterical. Tonight, fellow town meeting members, do the right, albeit difficult thing, and please remember this body's past action. Remember its proven logic, validated over decades. Please vote favorable action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Snuffer and Mr. Snuffer. Ms. Donnellan.
Hi, Donna Donnellan, Precinct 6. My initial response prior to doing more research was leaning towards saving the North Street property. However, as I did more research, I am now seeing both sides, and I'm quite honestly torn. I stand before you to ask for input to help aid in my decision-making process, so I'm listening to everything everyone has to say. First, I do not believe we need another daycare center in Walpole. There is one just a couple of miles around the corner on Route 109. Aside from that, the road is not conducive to having even more traffic congestion in that area. Traffic in the mornings on North Street heading toward 109 is out of control to begin with. That is the direction I was initially leaning toward. I understand that this daycare may be for up to 100 children, not to mention the staffing that would be required. That would be up to 100 vehicles coming in and out of that property during the course of a weekday, and not to mention what added stress it would add to our water supply. However, I'm playing devil's advocate. I don't believe that government should take away someone's property simply because they don't want a daycare there. Again, keep in mind, I don't want one there either. I understand that the town may do so by eminent domain, but for the sole purpose of telling an owner what he can or cannot do with his property may be somewhat unethical. For example, I would be extremely upset if the town attempted to take my property away because I wanted to do something with it that was technically legal, but the town didn't want me to do it. I'm trying to separate the reason for the town wanting to take this property from an owner's rights based on a legal standpoint. Regarding the Dover Act, which I believe is the loophole that is being referred to in this situation, it does allow the placement of any educational facility in any zoning situation. This is how the owner of this property might be able to put in a daycare center because of the Dover Act exempting the zoning laws. Again, my initial response is to vote to save this property, but in speaking with constituents, some have raised a valid point about an owner of property having legal rights and wanting to do with his property what he wishes based within the legal limits of his property. Again, I'm torn with this article, and I'm listening to everything that you all have to say tonight to try to make an educated decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Donnellan. Sir.
Clark, Precinct 7. This is probably a good follow-up to Mrs. Donlan's point there, where she mentions people that are torn about this article. So I would just want to point out to this body what's been made clear tonight by town council that might be of a different nature than we thought coming in, and that is this vote is not whether or not to purchase that property. This vote is whether or not to provide authority to a town board to pursue purchase of the property. So what's the difference there? A no vote now essentially represents no resistance to the intent of the owner, whereas a yes vote provides some resistance that says clearly this board, this town, if nothing else, is torn on the issue. Some of the points having been made in both directions. So it seems appropriate to me that this town go forward and provide a yes vote to allow that authority to proceed, in essence providing something of a stay of execution of this issue. A no vote essentially ends the issue and presents absolutely no resistance to the current owner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. Pila.
Mr. Moderator, through you, as the author of this substitute motion, I would like to just hit upon a few key points. Council mentioned that there are, and the Board of Selectmen mentioned in their deliberations, that there would be risk involved. Every morning we wake up, we take some type of risk, small, medium, and large. Life does not go without risks. If we have to take as a community, as a town of almost 25,000 people, if we care about what our town looks like, it is incumbent upon us to preserve what we inherited so that those who follow us can have the same appreciation for people who came before us. My initial reaction when I heard about this was that I also, coming home, come up through Route 109 and I go up North Street. And I've always been impressed with the bucolic nature of that road. Someone mentioned about the highest and best use for that property. Well, highest and best use is dictated by what zoning allows you to put on a particular property. The buyer, or the current owner of the property, proposes a use that is not consistent with the current zoning. But he has found or is using a particular tool called the Dover Amendment. But the Dover Amendment is to allow for non-profit educational facilities in a zone that normally may not allow that. There's a whole history behind the Dover Amendment, and I'm not going to bore you with that, but it is something worth reading. The owner is proposing a for-profit enterprise. The Dover Amendment also talks about the use being for educational purposes. We don't know what the programming of that daycare facility is going to be. Is it a daycare facility where you bring your young children off and someone watches them while you're at work or whatever other activities you do during the course of the day? Is it an educational facility? When we talk about good faith, the owner of the property has refused to meet with the residents to discuss what his plans are, or their plans are, after numerous attempts to reach out to them.
Mr. Pila, excuse me, your time is ended.
Okay. So I'd like to just end and say that this is a fight worth fighting. And coming from someone myself who's in the real estate industry, and I'm totally opposed to municipalities taking property by eminent domain, I think this is an exception to the rule, and I think it is worth our coming together as a community if we really care about the future of our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pila. Mr. Moraski.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct 8. Just a few questions. I see the word borrowing in the substitute motion, so I'm assuming it's a 2/3 vote. If the word borrowing wasn't in the substitute motion, would it still be a 2/3 vote based on the fact that it's an eminent domain article?
As would be incurring debt and in taking land, both require a 2/3 vote.
So both elements require 2/3.
Correct.
And my second question is with respect to our insurance policy. I'm assuming the town must have some type of an umbrella policy which protects it when the town is acting in good faith, like in this case where it's taking land for its property for its historical value. Do we have such an umbrella policy, and if so, what does it cover?
Mr. Johnson?
Joe, quite honestly, I haven't consulted with our insurance carrier on this, so I don't have an answer for you regarding whether or not we'd be covered and whether they would cover our lawyer expenses on this one. I'll try to get an answer for you by the end of the night.
Does Mr. Moderator, does Town Council have any experience with insurance policies that cover eminent domain instances?
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, the eminent domain portion likely would be picked up by the town. You'd have to look at your specific coverage, but typically you see the eminent domain typically is the cost of that appeal is undertaken by the town.
Okay, nobody from the Insurance Advisory Committee is in the audience, Mr. Moderator, who knows this question? No. My third point, Mr. Moderator, thank you very much for clarifying the roll call vote requirements. For a long time, we were just standing 20 members and not taking a vote after that. So it was great to have that clarified, and it does require a majority vote for adoption. But my question is, there's a second part of the roll call vote, and it says that if no less than 20 RTM members stand and challenge the call of a standing vote, we would then take a roll call vote. Would we need a majority vote in that instance, or would we just go to a roll call vote?
If 20 members, we've already gone to the roll call vote, and it's been voted by this not to have a roll call vote. So if, I understand your question is
Right.
that if members stand and challenge the standing vote count?
Correct.
If that happens, I'll deal with it at the moment. I want to talk, and I don't want to speculate on right now, but to me, my gut feeling right now is we've already asked and answered that question.
Well, it would look like, in all due respect, Mr. Murray, it would look like we tried to resolve a mistaken past practice with respect to requiring a majority vote for a roll call vote for 20 members asking for a roll call vote right from the get-go. And now we haven't taken the standing vote, so it would seem like we would be able to do a roll call vote after that standing vote, but I would defer to you.
Understood.
Thank you, Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Moraski. Mr. Abbott.
Bill Abbott, Precinct 6, through you to Town Council. If I understood you correctly, the town definitely has the ability to take by eminent domain for historical and preservation purposes. But one of the risks that you mentioned, I believe the first risk, was that if there was some sort of bad faith that we were voting, and it sounds like the fact that we've already discussed that we don't want a daycare in this particular site, have we just increased the risk, in your opinion, of providing a very good excuse for the owner of the property to challenge?
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, I think that there might be an opportunity for someone to capitalize on that.
Thank you. That's what I thought.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott.
Majeski, Precinct 8. I'm speaking because if I don't, I know I'll regret it, and I feel if we don't stand up for this, we'll also regret it. I wanted to cover the historical aspects, the lack of pros as I see them, and the potential cons if we allow this to happen. On the historic side, if it's our constitutional right, let's do this. It is a pretty area. I think we've all gone down this street. I never open the window. You can see my hair. It blows everywhere. But every time I drive down this street, I open the window and I smell the fresh air. And as Mr. Snuffer spoke earlier today, we made this stand for Adams Farm. Why wouldn't we do this for the house across the street? It's the same area. As for the pros, the daycare centers in Walpole currently,
Please, Ms. Majewski, please speak into the microphone. I know you want to turn and face the audience, but there's a wide audience out on TV, too.
very true. So some of the daycare centers include...
They're working on it. One moment. Just bear with me one sec. You know what? Come down front while they fix it. Keep it moving.
Hello. Some of the daycare centers, when I pull up Google, include Sunshine on the Common, Paddington's Place, Rosie's Day Preschool, Walpole Kindercare, Nossel Family Daycare, Sunny Days Academy, Next Generation, which I'll get to later, Amo at Docio, Liberty, Gagney, Barnyard. 2 individuals are listed, Spring Forward, School Age, ECDC, and the list goes on. We have plenty of daycare options. And for North Walpole, too, when you're thinking about your commute to leave North Walpole, you're likely entering either the center of town, which has daycare centers, you're going to Route 27, and for anyone who drives on Route 27, since that parking lot by the train station has been there, you've probably noticed increased traffic. I take the train, I used to take 95, I take the train now, and I need to leave 5 minutes later because of that traffic increase there. So you're either going that way or you're going up North Street, and then Next Generation on 109 is 3 minutes from this block. So it's not too hard for people to go there instead. You're already driving in that direction. And then as for that traffic too, I'm seeing that traffic from the parking lot. If we have a daycare center with 100 children there, that is 100 families during rush hour time going there, going after. Anyone going to Bubbling Brook after work, there will be traffic there that will affect our quality of life. So I think there are a lot of risks if we allow this to happen, and I just wanted to say that there's also a property value potential risk too. Historic areas can be up to 20% higher in value if we allow this to happen. That affects that area as well. And I know my parents, when they chose Walpole, we had no connection here. They drove down North Street. They checked out that commute, and they loved just driving down that street. If we allow that to change, I definitely see a risk to commuters choosing to move to Walpole, build their families here, bring tax dollars, residential tax dollars into town, because they're going to see the risks of having a high population here, driving down that street, and affecting their commute to get out of
Excuse me, Ms.
Walpole.
Majewski, your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Khatib.
I think I'm next.
Actually, Ms. Khatib's been over there for quite a bit. You are at the microphone now. We'll get to you in a moment.
Sarah Khatib, Precinct 8. I rise in opposition to this substitute motion. Similar to what Mr. Abbott brought up and Town Council outlined, there is a significant risk that in doing so, we could be acting in bad faith. And one of the things that they would look for is that the real reason for taking the property is to stop the proposed use of the property owner, which to me seems exactly what this body is trying to do. So I am uncomfortable with the risks that would be associated with that. If you look to the petitioner's original statements, in there, she outlined it was going to be a daycare. They don't have any, history of running a daycare. This is inappropriate. So in her proposal, she's saying we need to stop the daycare. So I just think that it's irresponsible use of town government, and I'm personally not comfortable with the risks and costs associated with this.
Thank you, Ms. Khatib. Yes,
Susan
ma'am.
Masterson, Precinct 3. I believe in conservation and preserving this house, but I'm more concerned about this daycare. You say these people have not had experience before. Do they even have a license to operate a daycare? I mean, to operate a nursing home, you need a license. To operate any healthcare type facility, you need a license. And now I just hear that they haven't even presented a mission or a vision for the children of the town that are going to go there and should be from probably 6 months old, be educated until they haven't said at what age they're going to stop. They're going to stop.
Excuse me, Ms. Finley. Mr. Cheskarowski, your point of order. I'm going to allow her to continue for a bit, but please center your remarks on the substitute motion.
I just don't think it should be done for the sake of a daycare, because you know what if they don't have a license? What if they fail and they don't get the license and the house is already torn down? We're out of luck.
Thank you, Ms. Finley.
Kister DeMasso, Precinct 2. I may have not understood something that Mr. Peeler said. Maybe town council can just correct me. The Dover Amendment, I thought he said something about it not being applicable to for-profit schools. Is it both for-profit and nonprofit schools?
Town council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, the Dover Amendment, so-called, is Chapter 40A, Section 3, which sets out almost a dozen types of exemptions, from agricultural uses to religious uses to group homes, solar, and so forth. And there are two that may apply here. One is the educational use exemption, which requires that the educational operator be either the Commonwealth or a government agency, or that they be a non-profit to obtain that exemption. But there are other exemptions under 48 Section 3, including for a child care facility. And so if a child care facility satisfies the criteria for the definition of a child care facility under Chapter 15D, Section 1, which includes for-profit operations, then they could have that exemption.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masso. Sir.
Brain, Precinct 2. I stand in favor of the motion. Personally, I don't care if they put up an exact reproduction. It would be a loss. Daycare center aside. They put up an exact reproduction of a salt box. It would still be a loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brain. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I just want to clear up a point. When the purchaser of this land bought this land, it was not zoned for daycare. It was zoned residential. And now, with an attempt to come in with a loophole in possibly our zoning or the state zoning, he is looking to do a daycare center, which is almost obviously a commercial daycare center in a residential property. So I don't see any grandfathered rights here. We all have rights for the property we own. He bought property with rights, and he should only be able to execute those rights, not gain new rights by a loophole in the zoning law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Marcados.
Yes, Michelle Mercados, Precinct 7. Through you, moderator. I have a question. On information in my packet said the hold on the property is in effect until May 27th. So there's a lot to be done before May 27th if we vote to ask the Board of Selectmen to look at eminent domain. What happens? Could Mr. Allen tear down the house when we're doing our work? Or can we extend that 6 months? Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, through you, right now the bylaw, the demolition delay bylaw is 6 months, and so without a change to that bylaw, that 6-month period will expire, I believe, on Monday, May the 28th. And so if they are in possession of the property and there's not an amendment that affects them, and they get their demolition permit, and the property hasn't been taken, then yes, they could go ahead and demolish.
Ms. Markakos, I just want to ask you to keep it specific to this article because there is an article on the demo. That's okay. You can continue with your comments, but I just didn't want you to go too far down that path.
I'm just concerned that if we think we can stop this and how we vote, he could be tearing down the house while we're in the middle of trying to decide, how to legally do this, if we approve this. And I just want to make sure that the house doesn't get torn down while we're trying to work it out. I am trying to address this motion.
Yes.
Sorry.
But your question has been answered. It's on May 28th, they
could tear
they
down.
could proceed.
Okay. And I understand everybody's passion, and I feel for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bowen, Mr. Pila, sorry.
Tom Bowen, Precinct 6, also Finance Committee member. Most votes we take are simple and easy, and they're not going to get anyone angry. But sometimes you have to do the right thing, which makes people angry. This came before Finance Committee, and Finance Committee did what it sometimes has to do, is be the people who say no. It's ironic, this house was built before the Revolution. One of the great things they were pushing for was rights, and property rights were huge. And that's why we're so strict in America with eminent domain. It's not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be super zoning. It's not supposed to be, I don't like my next door neighbor's house. There are many reasons that we should oppose this house being turned into a daycare center, and it can be done with hopefully a delay in the next article and some other methods. But I have to say, one of the first things is, people are saying, oh, he won't talk to us. I thought this was America. Who said he had to? If someone wants to buy your house and you don't want to sell it, you don't have to sell it. That's America. Like it or don't like it. We have to respect individual rights. If we don't respect that, then what are we? In terms of the house itself, and one of the key things in the legal documents we've seen, and even when we discuss our Finance Committee, we're on tough ground with this. Because much of the debate tonight has been about the daycare center. It's pretty clear that should we end up in court, we may have an issue because no one wanted to save this house a year ago for its great historic value. And it does have value. But it's pretty much because we don't want a daycare center there. I think we're in rough shape going before court, and frankly, I wouldn't like to be our attorney trying to defend us on this. There's videotape at all the other meetings where we discuss it, and it makes it a pretty, if our council does well with this, I'd be impressed. But it all boils down to me to be individual rights. There's nothing more important than life, liberty, and one of the things we're so concerned with is property rights. And just because we don't like it doesn't mean the government should take it and give it to the next guy in line. It's as simple as that for me. We're not super zoning. We don't take property in America easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen. Mr. Pila, you have to defer to Mr. Forsberg. He has not yet spoken.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Forsberg, Precinct 7. If this article was cut and dry, I'd be in favor of it. I'd vote for it right away, but I'm very apprehensive about it. And one of the things that the body has been talking about, they keep mentioning nonprofit or profit schools. But if you take in our zoning bylaw, table 5B1, in 1B, it actually says educational uses, and that is allowed in all districts in the town. And then if you go down to 1D, it says private or profit schools, and that is only allowed in the CBD, the highway business, LM, and industrial by special permit. But then if you go down to 1F, it says nursery school, another agency for daycare of children, and it's allowed in all areas. So that has nothing to do with profit on that. And my next question through you, Mr. Moderator, would be to Town Council. On page 3, your last paragraph of the comments, and you had mentioned about damages. And would damages also include loss of earnings through Excuse me? No, what I'm asking is, if the daycare was to go in there and they were earnings, their loss of earnings for not being able to run the daycare, would they be able to come after the town for those as damages?
Town council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, the highest and best use of the property, the fair market value as of the date of the taking, would be the point at which the appraiser would give the value on. And so would look at the overall value of the property based upon all of the elements that go into what it makes it the highest and best use of the property in the appraiser's determination.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Moderator, so it's only the property value, it has nothing to do with earnings or any other losses?
Well, you're really asking an appraisal question, and you know, I hesitate to go there. You know,
well, I'm not.
It's a mixed question of law and fact. I don't know what the highest and best value of this property is, what the highest and best use of it is. I just don't know. And certainly when the evaluation of the property is done, they will consider, well, what could you use it for? What would it be valued at based upon what you can use it for? And so if there's an ability to use it and get income from it, that presumably would be part of the overall calculation as of that point in time when the taking occurs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forbury. Ms. Lawson.
Lawson, Precinct 2, and also a member of Finance Committee. When Finance Committee read Town Council's memo, it was clear to us that this would be very, very risky business. I think it's already been clarified that the Dover Amendment does apply, that this gentleman is within his rights to put a daycare center in there. Let me just say that I am very unhappy that a daycare center may end up on North Street, and I understand the passion that's felt by this body. Having said that, I think the legal guidance we have from Town Council is a clear warning to this body that if we proceed, we, in all likelihood, will fail and will incur not only the cost to do this to begin with, but legal fees and possibly damages. So I think it puts us in a very, very dangerous position, one that, as someone who is charged with conserving funds in this town and being a good steward of the funds that we have, I am vehemently opposed to. And I also want to point out that there is a lesson here for those who care about historic properties that we should be acting before they're threatened. This house has been on this property for a long, long time, and no one did anything until this gentleman bought it, and now everyone is up in arms. Again, I'm unhappy about a daycare center going in there, but I think that to vote for this substitute motion, or the main motion for that matter, to prevent, I'm sorry, for the substitute motion to try to prevent this gentleman from doing what he's legally entitled to do, will not only be costly for the town, but also puts us in the position of doing something with under the power of government that we should not be doing. Eminent domain is used to get something, a piece of property that a municipality needs. We would be taking something we don't really want, and we would be immediately trying to unload it on someone else. So it's not that Walpole wants this property, it wants to prevent the daycare center and then get rid of the property by selling it to someone else. It's an inappropriate use of eminent domain, in my opinion. I hope that there's a private settlement. I imagine if enough money were offered, this gentleman might sell. But in any event, voting for this might feel good, but in my opinion, it's the wrong decision and ultimately would be very costly to the town. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Ms. Brown, and Ms. Donnell, and the others speaking first. Thank you.
Susan Brown, Precinct 4. I'd like to respectfully disagree with Ms. Lawson and remind this body that the town council has also said it's a perfectly good use of eminent domain to take a property for historic purposes. And that clearly is one of the major, in my opinion, thing that we need to do here. I think if we we're looking at any other neighborhood where there was proposed to be a daycare center, people might not like that, but it wouldn't have the same resonance as it does in this particular neighborhood where the historic value and the scenic value are extremely important. And as the Snuffer gentleman made clear earlier, I think when we have bought property in other ways, it's proven to be the highest and best use of that property, and we all would be in agreement about that. And therefore, I think we should not hesitate to stand up for what it seems clear to me is the highest and best use of this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Basovich?
Andrew Basovich, Precinct 2. So if I understand this, if we approve the substitute motion, we're not ourselves moving forward with the notion of seizing the property under eminent domain, but charging the town selectmen to further consider this possibility. And I'm wondering if that vote on our part wouldn't facilitate the possibility of negotiations with the individual who owns the property. That is to say, a statement of seriousness on our part, a statement of how we value the historical property because it's of great historical importance, not because it's going to be a child care center, wouldn't help shift the ground and position us to get a better outcome. Thank you.
Mr. Basovich, just one clarification. The vote will be to make the substitute motion the main motion first, and then subsequently we'll vote on the, if it becomes the main motion, we'll vote again.
Yes, and then
I just want to make sure that's clear so we don't twist it up again. Thank you very much for your comments. Ms. Gayotis.
Jennifer Gayos, it's Precinct 1. I also, as an attorney, am really concerned with the risk here. All I've heard tonight is the word daycare uttered over and over, and town council's opinion, where she states the likelihood of success of the claim is driven by statements made to town meeting as to the purpose of the taking. Everything that has gone on tonight, as people have said, just reaffirms that we're talking about not putting a daycare there. I also did have a question through you, Mr. Moderator, for Town Council. In addition to everything that's been stated here tonight, would you be able, if we had a lawsuit under this, would they be able to get discovery on motives by, for instance, getting email back and forth between the citizens who brought the petition? Or would it be just what's in front of us here?
Well, certainly discovery could obtain, and certainly they would look for a video, obviously, of this meeting. That would probably be the first thing.
But would it be just limited to this meeting, or the back and forth that went on between the citizens before it was actually brought to?
Certainly they could try to take the depositions, certainly of any one or a number of parties and ask for documents.
Including any emails that started this petition? Okay,
Potentially.
so as an attorney, that
But if I can just follow up, though, what's really at issue, though, in the event that there were an appeal, would be the hearts and minds of this body. It's about the legislative body and the motivation of this body. Certainly a petitioner, may have a particular point, but what's really at issue is what this legislative body does and whether town meeting has a bias. And as I mentioned, the case law is very clear. It's difficult to prove bias of a legislative body because there's an underlying presumption of regularity and of good faith. But as I said, they would be looking for the tape of the meeting and to determine, what was said, to try to glean what was the real motive behind the approval of the article if, in the end, it is approved, whether it was for the historic preservation purpose or perhaps motivated by something else.
including any letters that people had submitted ahead of time, right? To the body.
To whatever it is that was considered by the body, yes.
I can say, since I've received letters myself that also talk about the daycare as an attorney, I view this to be a substantial risk. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here. North Street is beautiful, but we really shouldn't be ignoring the risk here by doing a taking. It just seems that it's unnecessarily risky for the town. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gatos. Sorry, Mrs. Donnell. Mr. Murtaugh is behind you, is yet to speak.
John Murta, Precinct 5. I came tonight with an open mind, but I tell you, after listening to Town Council, I think the risks are substantial. This could turn into a very costly situation for the town. In the event of an appeal, and especially the jury, it goes to the jury. The damages the town could have to pay could be substantial. And I tell you, I'm not prepared to take the risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Murtaugh. Ms. Donnellan.
Donna Donnellan, Precinct 6. I just need some clarification. Is the owner, has he come forward as profit or nonprofit if he were to put a daycare there?
If I'm not mistaken, the owner's daughter and her attorney are here tonight in the back, if you would care to have a response from them.
Sure, yeah, I just need some clarification on that.
Or is the owner and her attorney still present? Would you like to respond to the question? Sure, come on down, please. Come right down here. You can come right down to the podium. We'll give you a front and center. Yeah, the questions will come to me and I'll ask you to respond. You can come right to the microphone. Ms. Donnellan, would you repeat your question, please?
Sure, through the moderator. I just need clarification as to the owner. Is he coming forward with the daycare plans as a profit or nonprofit?
And so, I'm sorry, Ms. Mazzello, if you could just state your name specifically, and thank you.
My name is Maureen Mazzola, and I am the owner's daughter and hopefully future center director of the school in question. It is currently structured as a for-profit model, which we can get into more later. I'm not just answering a question.
That's fine.
Okay, so I have an additional question then based on that information through your moderator. So doesn't that exempt from the Dover amendment? Because as I read the Dover amendment, it indicates that it has to be nonprofit. How are you able to get around that?
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, I have not examined any of the materials that that are proposed by the owner of the property. What we heard earlier is that they're any one of a number of allowed uses as of right that could allow this to go forward. And while there may not be and if not, and if that were to change, I know that there's an article that would deal with potential changes to the table of uses. As I mentioned earlier, under 40A Section 3, there are at least 10 different sets of exemptions, and one of them is for a child care facility, even if it is for profit. And so it may be that, that this concern could meet that exemption. Again, whenever a use is brought forward, it needs to, when the building permit is sought, when the application is put forward, the application needs to persuade the building official that the use is allowed under zoning either as of right or through special permit, and that if it's allowed by special permit, that the special permit has been obtained and perfected, or if there is an exemption that's sought under 48 Section 3, that all of the criteria for asserting that exemption have been satisfied, because the burden of proof in the event that an operator comes forward and asserts an exemption, the burden of proof rests with the party asserting the exemption.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nellen. Sir.
Hi, John Curley, Precinct 1. I move the question, please. To move it, the substitute.
I understand you've moved the question. Yes, do I have a second? Second. Mr. Buckley. All those, moving the question requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. I declare 2/3. So, all those in favor of making the substitute motion the main motion, please say aye. This requires a simple majority vote. Please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Tellers, please. Excuse me, sir, may you please take your seat, because we're on a vote now anyways. All those tellers in favor of making the substitute motion the main motion, please raise your hand. Tellers opposed to making the motion, the substitute motion the main motion, thank you. Okay, at this time, all those in favor of making the substitute motion the main motion, please rise and stay standing till the tellers complete their count, and I ask you to sit. Okay, on my left, Mr. Lombardi.
10.
Thank you, Mr. Lombardi. Mr. Laron, the right?
27.
27. Mr. Leith, the center.
24.
Thank you, Mr. Leith. You may be seated. All those opposed to the substitute motion becoming the main motion, please rise and remain standing. Mr. Laron, the left.
3.
Mr. Laron, the right. Thank you, Mr. Lombardi.
4.
And Mr. Leith, my center.
33.
33, thank you. Okay, so as some of you have probably that are faster calculating than me and verifying with the town clerk, we have a majority 66 to 41 with 107 members voting. So the substitute motion is now the main motion. Any questions or comments? Ms. Lawson.
Lawson, Precinct 2, and Member Finance Committee. Through you, Mr. Moderator, to I guess the Town Administrator, if this is approved tonight, how would we go about eventually selling this? Or what would be the process of, because clearly the town is not going to run this, own this and run it as a bed and breakfast. What would we do? How would we unload the property to a willing buyer? What is the process?
Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Moderator, through you. If this body voted for it and we went through the court process and the judge found in our order, in our favor, we would be owners of the property, and then to sell the property, we would need to come back to this body, be granted authority through the Board of Selectmen to sell it. The Selectmen would then need to do basically a reverse 30B, reverse procurement on this. We would need to send it out to bid. Anyone could bid on it, as I previously mentioned, and it would go to the highest and most responsive bidder, similar to what we did with the library just about 5 or 6 years ago.
Excuse me, Mr. Johnson. Oh, please hold your comments. I can hear you whispering up here. Please respect your neighbors. Thank you. Mr. Johnson, I apologize.
And similar to the process that you folks just approved a few nights ago for the property off of Industrial Road. It's a long process, but it's a process that we would adhere to.
And again, through you, Mr. Moderator, so would we be able to restrict it so that it could not be altered or in any way modified or whatever? Would we include those kinds of restrictions?
Yes, we could place a historical restriction or whatever the Board of Selectmen and eventually your body determined necessary.
Okay, and then through you, my final question is, what if no one bought it?
Mr. Johnson.
We would be the proud owners of 1350 North Street.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Mr. Abbott.
Bill Abbott, Precinct 6. I just would remind the members of the body here of what I had mentioned, what Ms. Khatib has mentioned, what Ms. Lawson has mentioned. We have spoken almost totally about a daycare center. I have heard nothing about historical purposes other than that it's old, 200 and something years old. I believe that we are setting ourselves up for tailor-made for the opposition to act against us on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Folks, please hold the conversation, please, and respect the speakers. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I was on the Board of Selectmen when we took by eminent domain Adams Farm. That was a $7 million taking.
Mr. Moderator, I got to correct that. We did not take that by eminent domain.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
I can think of several years of debt that...
Mr. Hamilton.
There was a vote to take it by eminent domain.
Mr. Hamilton, I think it's been clearly stated that we did not take Adams Farm by eminent domain.
No, because we were able to deal with the owner after the vote to take it by eminent domain.
Mr. Hamilton, your comments on the substitute motion for Article 39.
Right. And there were several articles that we took by eminent domain at town meeting that were never pursued by eminent domain. We made deals with the owners of the property. And that's an avenue that we can pursue here. These are not easy. They're not hard. We just have to do them. And I cannot understand why there are so many people concerned. I don't know what it would do to the tax levy on North Street if this were to go in. We might lose money on that, and we might have to widen North Street, which would require eminent domain takings to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Sherman?
Mr. Moderator, just a clarification, and
Yes,
I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Johnson.
I don't mean to interrupt. We are paving North Street this year, and there's no plans to widen or take it by eminent domain. I just want to clarify that. It drives me nuts sometimes when these allegations are made. I just want to follow up. The town is not going to be taking North Street by eminent domain, period.
Ms. Sherman. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Donna Sherman, Precinct 6. I came in carefully scripted tonight, and now with all the information you've offered, I am just down the middle on this, but I do want to make a couple of comments that I think that we have to look at this with a head and a heart. No one enjoys the sunset more than I do coming around the corner of North Street from Needham. And I moved from Needham because I found this town was such a gem, and I think it is. It's a unique small town. I am depressed by the overdevelopment in all the towns surrounding us. 5 blocks from my home will go up a high-rise building in front of the historical Walpole train station. I'm not happy about that either, but life goes on. But I do want to say that we do represent the 20,000 some odd neighbors and residents of ours. It's just not about us. It's about those people also who are not here to speak. And I have heard in my precinct, they do not want to carry any further obligations or risks with all that's going on in this town. It's like we're on steroids lately for acquisitions and expenditures. I also would like to say beyond that, I want to thank our town officials who volunteer and these committees who do this exhausting work. And I'm not so sure how much more we can ask them to do in addition to what they're doing currently as far as providing information and support for town projects. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. Mr. Fisher.
Jack Fisher, Precinct 3. Quick question to Mr. Johnson. I believe that what I've heard is that the expiration of the period of time when the demolition permit can be withheld is a week from Monday, the 28th. So if the builder would, if the owner were to go into the building department on the 28th and apply for a building permit, can it be held after that period of time?
Mr. Johnson.
If nothing changes after tonight, he could go in, pull the permit on the 28th, and knock the building down the 29th.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Leith.
John Leith, Precinct 1, also FinCom meeting member. As a member of the FinCom, charged with trying to do the responsible financial thing by the town, I agreed with my fellow members that financially this was a risky proposition. But I also want to say, and I may get some blowback for this, that speaking not as a FinCom meeting member, but as a person who's lived in the town for 32 years, and before then, a person who went through the town frequently, that part of North Street has always been an extraordinarily special area. And I guess my thinking is sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. And I think not going ahead with this is giving up. And I don't think we should give up. I don't think this is something that we should give up. I think it is worth fighting for. And I say that because of its beauty. I say that because of its historical significance. And I guess the one thing I want to close with, which may seem kind of trite, is the lyrics to a song that was written about 55 years ago by Joni Mitchell. And she said in that song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? Pave paradise and put up a parking lot. That's not what we want."
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton Precinct 5. I did misspeak. We didn't take it by eminent domain. We took it.
Mr. Hamilton.
It was an
point of order.
address.
Mr. Hamilton, please. The point of order. If it's what I'm talking about. Mr. Hamilton, we don't need to revisit that. If you have new comments about the now main motion, please proceed. Otherwise, please take your seat. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton.
I would like to move for a roll call vote. Thank you.
I need 20 other members to stand with Mr. Hamilton for a roll call vote on the main motion. Folks, if you're going to stand, please stand. Okay. I do not, I have count 17 members standing. Mr. Forsberg? So there will not be a roll call vote. The motion failed. Mr. Forsberg?
Dan, how many times did you not call on me properly in the FinCom? You know, Eddie's a friend, but...
Mr. Nordebart, it's the microphone. I don't know who's throwing their voice up there.
I'm here now.
You know what? You can
and
ask
I just want this body to know we've been battling for 2 years. Susan and all the people on the FinCom have been with me every step of the way as you
Mr.
ignored me.
Nordebart, my sincere apologies.
You're very welcome.
And to you, Mr. Pila, I finally got your name correct, as you've noticed. I've been practicing.
Thank you, Ed.
At least just say my name right, so when you finally get it right. But I've had quite a bit of opportunity to talk to Sue Shock, and I know her. We discussed this at pretty good length at the FinCom. And I tell you, I'm very troubled by this whole thing. And I agree with it's a bad precedent to get into taking things by eminent domain. And I've read what Councilor Quirk has given us, and I believe very much in her guidance. I used it when I was on the planning board as chairman for 1 year. She practically had to talk to me every day to explain certain things so that the complications could come out and we would hopefully get to the right decision. What I think is discouraging to me is you've got people who will stand up for landowner rights. And yeah, there are landowner rights. But there are also, you know, carpetbaggers and people that come into town. You know, I can't, in my own mind, think that a reputable person would not want to talk to Jim Johnson, who's made repeated efforts, I believe, to reach out to the owner to see if there was a compromise solution that was outside the avenue of this town meeting. What I would like to see, and I don't know if the young applicant is here or, you know, she's the owner now, I believe. I don't think they live there yet. But I would think it would be incumbent upon you to come forward in good faith and try to negotiate some sort of resolution. Nobody is really happy about the way the thing is going. And you can put it there. You know, I hope I'm not saying anything, Alana, that's going to get me into trouble. I'll probably get arrested. Mr. B, you know, Mr. Well, all right, you got my back.
We have some nice new cells, Mr. Nordebart.
John's.
If you've been to the police station, I visited it this past weekend.
No, I'm going over there. John said he wouldn't arrest me. But I think Mr. Hamilton might. But the thing that I'm concerned with is nobody would want this to happen in their neighborhood. And I think there's a lot of people in South Walpole, North Walpole, East, West, that could be presented with the same problem. It could happen. You know, I used at the FinCom the example, I've got a property across the street from me, they're improving. And my big fear is that the lady's going to sell it. She's in her 80s. Her kids would probably just sell it, and the same thing could happen. But Mr. Bisevich and I think it was Dave Clark, a lot of people have what I consider really good arguments. I totally support, though, Alana's position on this. And what I would like to have everybody do is take a look at this thing and see if there's some way we can find a compromise. And I really want to reach out to the people that have bought that property to realize it's not the right thing for that particular neighborhood. There are plenty of commercial properties. I know Joe Moraski might get mad at me about commercial and some of that, but on the other hand, it's a
Mr.
tough
Nordebart, please
street.
wrap up. Your time is up.
30 seconds?
Go ahead, Mr. Nordebart.
Okay. I just, you know what, I'm passionate about this whole town meeting process. And we're kind of held hostage by two people that have just become interlopers who now are taxpayers. Thanks very much, everyone.
Mr. Nordebart, thanks for your comments and your levity. Yes.
Hi, Kathleen Grulich, Precinct 8. I just want to get one thing on the record as I analyze this myself, and I think I speak for many of my fellow members of the body. I'm not thinking of it as a daycare. It's not the fact that it's a daycare that gives me pause. Walpole has at least 9 daycare centers currently. We are very friendly to daycare centers, and I have to assume that the buyer of this property has done analysis that says there's a market for it. That's not my problem with it. For me, it's, as we started this evening talking about, as you come up the hill and you see that view, the thoughts of that house being gone and pavement being there, I don't care whether it's a convenience store or a, any other body. It's not a daycare per se. And I think it's unfortunate people keep mentioning the word daycare, but that happens to be the use that's on the table. I don't think the daycare is somehow specifically the problem.
Thank you, Ms. Grulich. I just want to, I want to notify the body that there's no other couldn't answer, but the property owner and her attorney are willing to speak, and they do have a right to speak after all the RTM members are done. So I just want to put that out there for you folks. Sir.
Brian Connor, Precinct 8, RTM. Question I have relates to any business that were to go in there under the bylaws or the zoning laws that would allow it, no matter what it is. So I'm not going to use the daycare thing. Whatever could go in there. There was talk about if the business fails, we're left with a non-conforming building on that property. I'd like to understand what that risk and damage could be to the town or challenge it could be for the town if something like that is there, if that could be explained by anyone.
Jim, Mr. Johnson?
You know, common sense says after it's constructed, it's there. They'd have to go, if they want to put it to the same use, that would be acceptable, but if not, they'd have to go back before the zoning board for a variance, right? Or which board, Atlanta?
Town Council.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I believe that there are no use variances allowed. So in the event that an exempt use were to go in, or a non-conforming use, and then it was no longer an exempt use or it was no longer a non-conforming use, then you couldn't use the property. It would have to go to a conforming use. And if the only use that would be allowed would be a residential use, it would need to be converted to a residential use.
Thank you.
Or there could be a zoning change. That's always a possibility.
All right,
as well.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connor. Ms. Mazzolo and Attorney Chapman. You may.
I'll make this very brief. I'm Tyler Chapman, an attorney. I live in Sherburne, nearby, practice in Boston. Maureen and her father, David, found me just because I do a lot of eminent domain work. But in the course of representation, I found out that actually she did operate the child care center where my daughter went when she was 3. So I heard a statement earlier that she's got no experience and that they're greedy people. And I think those are false statements, and it's unfortunate misinformation. The main reason I came to talk here, I've never spoken at a town meeting before. I usually do my talking in court. But the reason I came here is in answer to some of the comments that people made, Maureen and David are willing to meet with Ms. Shockett and her group. I spoke to Mr. Johnson about that today. I think if this goes forward, unfortunately, I'm going to have to do what I normally do, which is to focus on dealing with this in a legal means. So I hope that rather than passing this today, the body will vote no and allow us to have an opportunity to speak with Ms. Shockett's group, and maybe there is a very positive outcome that can come from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney Chapman. Ms. Shockley.
So there's one thing I get a little sensitive about, and that is my integrity being questioned. That's one thing I like to pride myself on. Maureen, have you owned and operated a daycare center previously?
Ms. Shockley, please direct your questions to the moderator, and if I deem it appropriate, I will redirect.
I apologize.
That's quite all right.
I would like Ms. Mazzola to clarify, has she owned? Because my statement was this would be their first attempt owning and operating. That was what I said.
Point of order.
I'm aware that that she
Yes.
ran
Yes. Excuse me
Sorry.
one moment. We have a point of order. Yes, Mr. Kraus.
Number one, I don't think she needs to answer that. Number two, this isn't about the daycare per se. It is about whether a business is going in there, whether we are going to honor a historical building. I can go on all night. We've
Okay.
been doing this for 3 hours. But I find it distasteful to challenge the potential owner.
And Mr. Kraus, I was actually about to say, I don't want this to.
Okay, I just want to say that.
They've offered to meet. Let's take that outside of this meeting, and this
Okay.
body has to decide based on the information at hand.
Okay, and just to clarify, their offer to meet is extraordinarily new, and it's the first that I've heard of it.
It's understood.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shockley. Any other questions?
Point of order as well?
Yes.
Through you, Mr. Moderator. To your point, that did come into our office yesterday, and it's new news to us as well as a sit-down and a face-to-face, so you are correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. I'll keep this brief. Megan Ahigian, Precinct 1, also FinCom. As I'm sitting here, I feel my emotions kind of rising. I feel sad about a beautiful 300-year-old building possibly being torn down and altering the landscape that I think we all feel very passionate about. I feel fairly angry that someone would try to bring this upon the town without having a good faith conversation. But ultimately, this is business. This is, we are in this role because we need to make responsible decisions and how to use the town's funds. And given the arguments I've heard today about the costs and the long process involved and the litigation that we would be exposing the town to, I think that we need to make this decision a business one and focus on the important things that we would rather be spending this money on rather than court battles with people who, we don't really need to spend our money focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hagan. Any other questions or comments? There being none, the motion requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion does not pass. That is not a 2/3 vote. The motion fails. It has to be a 2/3 vote. I'm going to say at best I heard a majority vote out there. If someone would like, they can ask for a standing vote. Okay, can I have it? I need 6 other members to rise for a standing vote. Thank you. Tellers, please rise. Yes, thank you, Mr. Trudell. Any tellers that spoke on the article? I believe Mr. Leith, you spoke. I need a replacement for Mr. Leith in the center. Anyone? Thank you. Mr. O'Leary, thank you. Yes, Mr. Forsberg, you spoke too, didn't you? Let's err on the side of caution. Can I have a stand-in for Mr. Forsberg? Anyone that didn't speak? No, it has to be on the left side, thank you. Sir, your name? Conley, thank you, Mr. Conley. Okay, so tellers, only standing. Those in favor of the main motion, please raise your hand. Tellers only. I have my 6 tellers. Thank you. It's actually now the main motion, so thank you. You may put your hand down. Those opposed to the main motion, please raise your hand. Thank you. Okay. If you are in favor of the main motion, please rise and stay standing while the tellers count. Mr. Laronde.
18.
18 from the right. Mr. Conley, the left.
6.
Thank you, Mr. Conley. Folks, please remain standing while the tellers in the center finish their count. Mr. O'Leary?
23 in the center.
23 in the center. Thank you. You may be seated. All those opposed to the main motion, please rise and remain standing. Mr. Laronde, the count on the right.
13.
Thank you, Mr. Laronde. Mr. Conley.
7.
7 on the left. Mr. Buckley. Thank you. If it's off by 1, I'm blaming you. Mr. O'Leary in the center. Excuse me? 34. You may be seated, thanks. The official tally is 51 in favor, 56 opposed. We did not achieve a 2/3 vote. The motion fails. We'll take a short bio break. Please be back in 5 minutes so we can finish up. Please take your seats, folks. Okay. We will now, I have a motion from Mr. Trudell to take Article 38 out of order. That's been seconded by Mr. Gallivan. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. Article 38. Article 38. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to not approve the amendments to the demolition bylaws is found on file in the office of the town clerk. This is a petition of the Historical Commission. Mr. Trudell, the Finance Committee vote?
Finance Committee voted 6-5 for unfavorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Trudell. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen vote on Article 38. Yes, sir.
The Board of Selectmen voted favorable action 5-0-0.
Favorable 5-0-0. Thank you, Mr. Kraus. The Planning Board, I believe the Planning Board voted on this article. Any members of the Planning Board speak to that? No vote. Thank you. I have a substitute motion on Article 38 submitted by Mr. Salvatore and seconded by Mr. Kraus. It is moved that there be favorable action on Article 38 as printed in the warrant and with the fine amount specific to set to $300. We have a presentation from Mr. Obar from the Historical Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Sam Obar, Chairman of the Historical Commission. Knowing that I only have 5 minutes, I limited the presentation to that limit, but I know you'll probably have a lot of questions. You can follow along with the information that we provided in your RTM packets. So everything I'm about to discuss, you have in your RTM packets. Next slide, please. So this bylaw has been in existence in Walpole since 1973. It was last updated in 2005. It's in place in 150 cities and towns across the state of Massachusetts. The length of the delay ranges from 21 days to 2 years in the town of Milton. Essentially, under the bylaw, the Historical Commission reviews any application for the tearing down of any structure more than 100 years old or on the National or State Register of Historic Places. If the structure is historically or architecturally significant, we may impose a delay of up to 6 months on the demolition. Next slide. The process is very specific and has there are specific requirements as far as that timeline, and that is laid out in your RTM packet, and so you can refer to that. Next slide. There are more than 1,000 structures, including houses, outbuildings, sheds, etc., that are more than 100 years old and would fall under the jurisdiction of this law. However, on average, there have been fewer than 5 applications per year to tear down these structures, and we've been averaging in the past several years fewer than 2 of these per year are usually deemed historically and or architecturally significant. Next slide, please. This is an example of a house that, on which a delay was imposed. That delay will expire on May 27th. This is 1350 North Street. Next slide, please. We are proposing to make various changes, which we will talk about and on which I'm sure you will have many questions on. We've been working on making changes to this law since 2016. We've been working extensively with the inspections office, and we also met with the selectmen in early 2018 to talk with them about what we were proposing to do, and we received favorable feedback. So this has been a long time process, several years in the making. We are proposing to add some sections with language from the Mass Historical Commission's model bylaw, and we also reviewed the same laws that are in place in other cities and towns and we took some language from them. Next slide. So there are both major and minor changes that we are asking to make. It is our intent, with the support of your body, to strengthen our ability to protect historic structures in our town by extending the length of the delay to 12 months from its current 6 months. And we also want to make other changes that are more smaller in nature, such as fixing typos and other things like that. A longer delay period would ensure that historically significant structures in the town will be less likely to be torn down or even threatened to be torn down, because a longer time window will require a property owner or developer to explore more alternatives to tearing it down. The extension of the delay to 12 months is based on the recommendation of the Mass Historical Commission, and also to reflect input we have received from citizens of the town over the past several years. Most towns in Massachusetts that have this law on the books are in fact moving to having the delays of longer than 6 months. Next slide, please. So this is the big slide. This is the last slide, and this basically outlines all the changes we're seeking to make. And again, this is in your RTM packet. I don't know how much time I have, but essentially we can just leave that up there, and you can all read it in your packets. So it basically explains what we're attempting to do, and I will entertain any questions you may have. Thank you.
Sam, you can seat, and I'll refer to you if we need to.
Thank you.
Ms. Sullivan.
Chandler Sullivan, Precinct 2. If this were to pass tonight, is there enough time to have a meeting between now and the 27th for 1350 to extend from 6 months to 12 months? And if so, does that allow the owners to have the meeting that just got presented yesterday, that they actually would talk to everybody, to occur to maybe reduce the amount of occupants from 100 to 50 or whatnot, to actually work as a friendly neighbor, as that hadn't really been done to this point?
Mr. Johnson?
Just to follow up to that, it would be very difficult, to be quite honest with you. I would be willing to have my staff facilitate a discussion, but I personally will not be there because tomorrow morning I'm getting on a plane going to Florida for the weekend with my wife. But we would be willing to have them in. I'm leery because I know this will impact another potential projects that is on the books, which is specifically Walpole Woodworkers. They are currently under the demolition delay bylaw, and if it were to pass, it would extend them by 6 months. I don't know how this just came up today at 4 o'clock. I don't know how that would impact that specific project. They are currently before the planning board. I believe they are going to request, or if they haven't already done so, an extension, because that board will likely change in 2 weeks, and I think they are going to want the whole new board to be voting in the same direction. So there are other repercussions there, but we would definitely be willing to facilitate a discussion at Town Hall as we offered back in January.
And the 6, through you, Mr. Moderator, the 6 to 12 month potential change, they still have the authority to pick and choose which ones get the full extension versus not? Is there any leeway in between that?
Mr. Johnson?
I'll defer to the chairman on this one, but I believe so.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Yes, we would have the authority to waive at any time, to shorten that at any point.
So it's just to make sure that the maximum amount is 12 months, but in this case, obviously everyone's hot to trot on the 1350. You could extend that 6 months, but if Walpole Woodworkers you want to not extend, that would be doable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Sir.
Ken Feddick, Precinct 3. The Historical Commission is not an elected group, and yet they can stop any project that they deem to be historically relevant. They currently have the power to do this for up to 6 months, and are working to extend it to 12 months. That can be a significant burden on a firm that, or a household that is purchased. Mortgage interest could extend over that 12-month period and be a significant expense. My own experience is colored by having lived in Medfield for several years before we moved here, and they have a very strong, I'll call it a preservation lobby. Not to demean the folks on that group, but and they have the Peak House, which is a jewel. But since that point, they have named 5 historic houses, and the demolition delay has been moved to 18 months. An example of the historic house, the Lowell Mason House on Adams Street. Apparently, Lowell Mason lived there at some point in his life, and the house is on a lot of over 1 acre. It is not a particularly, or was not a particularly attractive building, and it was not architecturally very attractive as well. The developer came in and he wanted to buy the property, which was over 1.5 acres, and build 2 duplexes. The Historic Commission stepped in. The developer offered to save the house by moving it onto a town-designated property about 1/2 mile away. The commission agreed. A flatbed truck came in, and it took about 6 weeks to get the house onto the flatbed truck, and it was moved over to the swim pool area. It sat vacant for 3 years and is now being renovated, and it has plastic siding, new roof, new windows, and it looks like any other modern house in the neighborhood.
Mr. Fettig, your time is up. Please wrap up.
Can I have a few?
You can ask for time. Mr. Fettig would like some additional time. All those in favor, please say
Okay.
aye. Continue, Mr. Fettig.
Thank you. The historic regulation is expensive. We will be voting on a renovation of the town hall within the next year or two, and I expect it'll go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you want to keep that in mind. A final irony, the Lowell Mason House is now on Ferry Street, or, Green Street, I believe. And it has a sign out front that says, birthplace of Lowell Mason. There is a monument on North Street that says it's the birthplace of Lowell Mason. And also there is Lowell Mason Road. I think they've done enough for Lowell. Also, if you're familiar, the state shut down Medfield State Hospital 15 years ago, and the Historical Commission hasn't approved any demolition of the buildings, and it continues to be an eyesore. I did support Article 39. I'm sympathetic to historical preservation and restoration, but I think it can get out of hand, and I want you to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fettig. Mr. Abbott. Keep talking, they'll get the mic. Nope. Bill, you want to come over and try this one right here? I'm thinking the battery's running over here. Right over here. Yep.
Again, I'm still Bill Abbott, still from Precinct 6.
Just a couple seconds older,
Yes.
right?
Yep. Through you, Mr. Moderator, to the chairman there. If you could just elaborate on the reason for going from 6 months to a full year, if you've had trouble. It doesn't seem unreasonable, but I'm just curious. Thank you.
Mr. Obar. Thank you, Mr. Abbott.
What we are attempting to do is to be proactive. There are a lot of historic structures in Walpole. The intent of extending the delay is to be a preventive measure against the tearing down of historic homes. A property owner who plans to purchase a property with the intent of demolishing it may not do so because they know they will have to wait 12 months as opposed to 6 months. And in many cases, depending on the scale of a project, it may take 6 months for a property owner or developer to obtain their approvals and permits from the town anyway. So 6 months simply does not serve the purpose it is supposed to be by, so essentially 6 months does not serve, it does not do what it is supposed to be. There are examples of where a 12-month delay would be more effective than a 6-month delay in protecting the house. We've had developers advise us that they plan to wait out the 6-month delay because their approval process lasts that long anyway. There are recent examples of where a 12-month delay could very well lead to the preservation of a structure and 6 months would not. An example would be the Allen House on East Street, which is where Walpole Woodworkers is, and the Smith Healy House at 1350 North Street. So, but I want to be clear that we as I mentioned, we've been talking about this for several years. So we really want to be proactive about protecting our town's historic assets, and we feel that in general 6 months is not long enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Obar. Mr. Flowers.
Andrew Flowers, Precinct 4, Finance Committee. I just want to go over a few reasons why I voted against this, but I must say, since I voted against it on the Finance Committee, I've thought about it more, and I've had some other more knowledgeable friends who know more about historic preservation convince me that to a point where I'm kind of waffling. So, but to get to my main point here, I'm worried about the increase in the demolition delay by law from 6 to 12 months. That power could increase the cost of housing in this town. Again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I mentioned it before, but in my view, increasingly restrictive land use regulations, which primarily it's zoning, but to some small portion it's historical preservation, when done badly, are responsible for a lot of the skyrocketing price of housing in Massachusetts and in this town. Now, I'm fully behind historic preservation. I just want the town to be cognizant and to be aware of how it can be heavy-handed at times. Now, is this increase from 6 to 12 months heavy-handed? So my main concern is when the demolition intent is to build multifamily housing, because my whole argument falls apart if it's just one new home, single-family home, replacing an historic home that's deemed historically significant by this commission, right? So what? That's just, as Sam said, only 1 or 2 times a year do they deem something historically significant. And if his whole intent, as I understand him, and I'm trying to read him in good faith, is to make this more punitive, to basically have more bargaining power on the town's perspective to deal with the developer and say, why don't you reconsider rehabilitation? Why don't you, reconsider and maybe preserve this home? If your whole intent is to have that more punitive power by extending this to 12 months, fine, if it's for a single-family home. But I worry in the case of Walpole Woodworkers, when it's one historic home, and there's a huge project for age-qualified villages, or if it's, say, a hypothetical in the future, a huge project for multifamily housing, maybe affordable housing, as I mentioned, that this bylaw, when it's many, many units and one historic home is involved with it, that 12-month delay is a huge factor in the developer's incentive of what they develop. If they're going to have to carry their property for an additional year, the additional interest, the additional cost of doing that, that's going to change their incentives of what they build. They'll build more luxury high-end stuff to make it economical for them if they know that they have to hold on to the property longer. So I wonder if there's a compromise here, because on the one hand, I'm 100% behind historic preservation, but if it's going to thwart needed development, then I'm against it. So those are my concerns. Thank you.
Mr. Obar, I don't think there was a question there.
Well, okay. Can I not respond?
After Mr. Salvatore speaks, yes.
Thank you.
You don't have to go away. You can stay.
I think one of the reasons that I was one of the proponents of the 12 months and one of the signers of the substitute motion is that what they've been finding is that 6 months is not enough time to explore all of the options. That while and 6 months, frankly, for many projects, they're still going through zoning and planning anyway. So they're not really incentivized to look for other options because they're going to run out the clock going through the other boards. So if with the 12 months, they really will need to look at other options, and they will have ample time to explore those options.
Thank you, Mr. Salvatore. Mr. Mercedes.
Harry Mercedes, Precinct 8. Mr. Obar, I definitely like your statement regarding the Historical Commission becoming more proactive versus reactive, which we've seen many times and more recently. The last article that was voted down skirts the zoning bylaws and the zoning board through the Dover Amendment. Within the 6 months, with that example and any other example coming forward, we've seen that that's gone very quickly. And the past property that we've discussed didn't have a chance to go through planning board. And I think the extension from 6 months to a year allows any property to at least get through one of these type of filters. In this past case, now the planning board will have time to look at the property that we just voted down on and at least try to go back and forth and figure out what will work there. So I think giving us an additional 6 months, whether it be any new property that comes in front of us or the one that we just voted on, allows some board in this town to oversee that process and give us a chance to make a good, educated decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mercedes. Mr. Oba, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I wanted to touch on the affordable housing issue because I understand and I respect that view. I do believe that housing is not affordable in Walpole, but first of all, there's actually, you know, and Mr. Flowers had brought this to our attention in the past, and I did, you know, I can't find any evidence in towns that have this bylaw that I can't find any evidence that housing has been less affordable as a result of this. The town of Milton just last fall increased the length of their delay from 9 months to 24 months, which is very aggressive. 2 years. The first town in the state to do that, and the town of Milton was unaffordable then and still is unaffordable, and I don't think that really had an impact. So as far as restrictive land use regulations, I think this is probably at the lowest level as far as what would impact that. The majority of our applications have actually been for historic houses that are replaced by very expensive houses, larger mansions, and again, this regulation has safeguards in place to ensure there's no overreach on our commission. I mean, there's a hearing process. Certainly someone could come forward and say, look, it would be cost prohibitive to keep the house, and we're going to replace it with something that would actually increase the values in the neighborhood, or would help the neighborhood, and that's something that we would consider during the hearing process. So, while I respect and I appreciate and I agree with the concerns about affordable housing, I don't think this is going to have an impact on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Obar. Ms. Dayan.
Nancy Dayan, Precinct 1. I'm wondering what are the procedures, or are there procedures in place that identify historical homes? Is there a list of historical homes that would be protected by this change?
Mr. Obar.
So in the bylaw, it actually defines what historically or architecturally significant is, and essentially that's basically what. So basically, the houses that are eligible under this law are any structure that is over 100 years old. So if it's over 100 years old, it automatically comes to our board, and then at that point we would make a determination based on the definition in the bylaw whether it is historically or architecturally significant, which is spelled out in the bylaw. I hope that answers your question. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yes, is there like a list, like next year, there's going to be houses that are 99 years old right now? Next year, they'll be going to the list,
Do you have
et
an
cetera.
inventory or a list of homes?
We don't have an inventory, but that would be something that the assessor would have. And, the assessor's department keeps track of which structures are more than 100 years old. And if it's more than 100 years old, then when an application is filed with the inspector, then it would go to us once it's more than 100 years old. I mean, the list would have more than 1,000 structures on it, so we don't maintain that.
Mr. Hamilton?
Hamilton, Precinct 5. Has the door been opened to ask a question on affordable housing?
No. Mr. Abbott?
Bill Abbott, Precinct 6. Through you, Mr. Moderator, to the chairman. Does the Historical Commission, do they have the ability to prevent somebody who has a historical home, doesn't want to demolish it, but in effect could demolish it by just, making wholesale changes to it? It's just really a piece of information I'm interested in.
I don't think I understand your question. Can you repeat that?
Instead of, it's clear you can stop or at least postpone demolition. Could somebody, in effect, demolish the home architecturally, let's say, and that's over 100 years old? Or can you stop somebody from changing something that has historical significance by, just making wholesale changes to it?
The demolition is actually defined in our bylaw, and it's defined as any act of pulling down, destroying, removing, or raising a building and/or structure, or commencing the work of total or substantial destruction with the intent of completing the project. So you'd have to basically be tearing down the entire structure. It can't just be like a wall. We don't get involved in that.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Thank you, Mr. Obar. Any further questions or comments? There being none, this motion to make the substitute motion the main motion requires a simple majority vote. I will point out that actually, one second. Okay, so we're voting now to make the substitute motion the main motion. It requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. It is a vote. We're now going to vote on it as the main motion, but before we vote on the main motion, are there any further questions or comments on what is now the main motion? The main motion is now that we're moving favorable action on Article 38 as printed in the warrant with the fine amount set to $300 per day. It's just a blank space in there. If you read, it was blank, left open, and they're just filling that with $300. So, Mr. Obar, that was $300 per day, right? If I recall off the end. Yep. Okay. So we are now, the main motion now requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. It is a vote. The article passes. We will now move to Article 37. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend the Walpole zoning bylaw is set forth in the warrant under Article 37. This is a petition of the Planning Board. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 12-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 5-0-0.
Who's?
Tim Higgins, Community Development Director, Planning Board, 5-0 in support.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Are there any questions or comments with regards to Article 37? Yes, Mr. Fisher.
Jack Fisher, Precinct 3, and for the record, I'm a member of the Board of Assessors and the Permanent Building Committee, but I'm speaking only as an RTM and an individual voter here, not representing. This what I say is not being, I don't want you to construe that I'm representing any of the boards. I urge you to be very, very careful about this. Zoning is not about ownership. Zoning is about use. This article is restricting the use of it's restricting what can be built, what can go on that, based upon the ownership. That's not what zoning is about. Zoning is about use. If you look at the zoning bylaws, it's the use table that says what goes into the zones. If you look at the zones, it's what's the use? Residential A, residential B, general residence, commercial, industrial, whatever have you. This is not at all appropriate for this town meeting to consider. This is about use. Zoning is about use. It's not about ownership. I urge you to reject this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Moraski.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct 8, and a member of the Planning Board. Can we have Town Council comment on the legality of this article, please?
Town Council.
Yes, Mr. Moderator. In my opinion, certainly having in the table of uses a use restriction so that a use is allowed, whether it's private or nonprofit, that is appropriate. That's not an issue.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So basically what you're saying is that the article as written is legal and proper before this town meeting.
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, just one caveat, of course, which is that, as we've discussed earlier this evening, there are a number of exemptions that are provided for under Chapter 40A, Section 3, almost a dozen, at least 10, and one of them is a child care facility, and so it is perfectly possible that there could be a for-profit educational for-profit use that is solely for a child care use that would get that exemption. I just want to make sure that that point is clear.
And there is absolutely no requirement of this town to list all those state exemptions in its bylaw, because state law overrides Walpole's town zoning bylaw.
Town Council.
There's not an absolute requirement. We've discussed in the past the potential for a housekeeping amendment, a footnote perhaps in the future to alert people to the fact that these exemptions are available, and a simple footnote that indicated, certainly this doesn't include any use that is eligible for an exemption under 40A section.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Moraski. Mr. Nordebart. Just kidding, gotcha. I had to do that for Mr. Nord. Mr. Forsberg.
Forsberg, Precinct 7. Through you, Mr. Moderator, to Town Council, this language would be put in table 5B1 under D, but and this says for profit, but would F, would this have would it conflict with F, which says nursery school or other agency or daycare of children? Because, I mean, it doesn't say whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. My other question is, how difficult is it to get a nonprofit status? I know like the PGA and the NFL are actually considered nonprofit, so how difficult would it be for an applicant to, state them, be considered a nonprofit?
So, Mr. Nordbart, if I'm not mistaken, nonprofit status is conferred, Mr. Forsberg, is conferred by the, so I did mess that up, got myself. So it is conferred, determined by the IRS, but as for your other town council, on his first question, or even a second?
Certainly as to the second one, there's a process to become a nonprofit, and it may not be difficult, may result in some delay, but certainly it can happen. With respect to your first question, I think it had to do with whether there are any conflicts within the table of uses.
Right.
And I'm not sure which one you're referring to. Can you show me which one you're referring to?
Yeah, I give her my copy.
Okay. Mr. Moderator, through you, the 2018 version of the zoning bylaw under Table 5-B.1, Use Table Number 1, Public, Semi-Public Institutional Uses, D and F. D is private for-profit school, and F is nursery school or other agency for the daycare of children. So there is a difference between a school versus a nursery school or a daycare, just simply for the care of children. I do see a difference between them.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure of that, because I know when I was on the planning board, there was a few times that you would make one change in one section and it would affect something and they were contradicting. So I just wanted to make sure that those two do not contradict each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Ms. Grace.
Audrey Grace, Precinct 6. I have just another question. If this were entered into the use table, could someone could still build a private for-profit nursery school or any educational or daycare institution operated by a private profit-seeking business using the Dover Amendment?
Town Council.
There's the potential, if certainly as I mentioned before, there are numerous exemptions under 48 Section 3, including for child care facilities. Child care facilities are defined under Chapter 15D, Section 1, and there are two types. One is for school-aged children under the age of 7, and then there are other criteria, and then there's a separate one for children over 7 or over, up to, I believe it's 14. But all of the criteria need to be satisfied for the exemption. And as I mentioned earlier, in the event that an exemption is asserted by any operator, the burden of proof is on them to show that they satisfy each and every criteria in order to have that exemption awarded to them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Ms. Khatib.
Sarah Khatib, Precinct 8, also a member of the Planning Board. So when we discussed this in the Planning Board, I asked the question, is it legal for us to even say that we can't allow a nursery school, all the language here. And we didn't really get a response until after our public hearing. And you've commented here at town meeting, but I'm still unclear. Like, it seems like there's no point to this because that a nursery school, educational, daycare would be exempt under 40, Section 3. So I know you choose your words carefully, but it just seems, I don't know why we would vote for it, because from what I'm hearing, there's no teeth to it. So why put it in the bylaw if it's not doing anything for us? So I don't know. You've already given your opinion, so I don't know that you would say anything more, but to the body, I think we should vote it down. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me why we would add it.
Any further questions or comments? Mr. Murtaugh.
Yeah, John Murtaugh. I think we're treading on thin ice here. I think the Dover Act could supersede non-profit as well as, I think I think we should vote down this article because the Dover Act would supersede. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murtaugh. Mr. Moraski.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct N8. Question for Town Council. Can you go over again for this body what this bylaw does in terms of profit education systems that would have a child care component to it, and whether or not that would be allowed in a residential district?
Town Council.
Through you, Mr. Moderator, I can't speak to the motive, certainly, of the petitioner. I would leave that to you, but my understanding, my interpretation of what this would do is to say that if you're a for-profit educational use, whereas it now may be allowed as of right, it no longer would be allowed as of right. And certainly the exemption for educational uses under 48 Section 3 is for private nonprofits. But as I've said, if you have a pure child care facility use, even if it is for profit, that may meet the criteria for an exemption for a child care facility under 48 Section 3.
So, in conclusion, there is an aspect of this bylaw, this potential bylaw, that we're asking town meeting to approve, which does, in fact, have some teeth to it. And however, there are some exemptions to the bylaw that are state exemptions, which also have an implication here.
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you, yes, and when the AG looks at this and reviews this, the AG may say, look, we think that we interpret this as creating an issue with respect to the application of state law. If they were aggressive about that, they could say, you need to make, they could strike it down, but what is more likely is that they would give a caution to say, as applied, when you use this, you cannot run afoul of the exemptions that exist if they're proven. And you have to allow those exemptions under state law in the event that someone conforms to the criteria.
Correct, and I would agree with that. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Moraski. Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, this motion affects the change to our zoning bylaw, so it requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. I declare it's not a 2/3 vote. Article 40. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town take no action. This is a citizen's petition. Mr. Stas, vote of the Finance Committee.
No action. 11-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
No action. 3-0-2.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Higgins.
Planning Board, no action, 5-0.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 40? There being none, this motion for no action requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Please hold on 1 second. I should have done this earlier. I just want to make a note that this is the last evening Mr. Kraus will be sitting at the head table as the chairman of the Board of Selectmen. I'd like to thank him for his service as a selectman. Mr. Kraus has about a 15-minute speech he'd like to give at this point in time, speaking to his accomplishments, but if somebody who has a motion to adjourn, I will accept that. To dissolve, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Snuffer. Seconded by Ms. Lawson. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Unanimous. Senior.